we have Anushka Jogalekar, and she's a sophomore at EDHS.
She plays the sitar and does LD debate. And she will be talking about intersectional feminism. Please welcome Anushka.
Instead of a man's world, it's a burger's world, and ladies are pizza. That's how comedian and author Akilah Hughes explains the concept of intersectional feminism. She uses a pizza metaphor to describe the different forms of discrimination people face based on their race, their sexuality, their class, and their gender identity. In the metaphor, burgers is code for men, pizza is code for women, cheese pizza stands for white women, and deluxe pizza stands for any combination of gay, bi, trans, person of color, says Hughes. As she explains the dynamic between burgers and pizzas, and how cheese pizzas get the most recognition out of any type of pizza. Say you're born a cheese pizza, and the world is made for burgers. You can go anywhere and get a burger. Burgers are the go-to fast food. Pretty much everything in the world is made to serve burgers, Hughes says in the video. She adds, so we're trying to say, hey, pizza is just as good as burgers. Pizza is just as satisfying as burgers. Pizza deserves the same rights as a burger. And that's all fine and good. But then there's pizzas like me, deluxe pizzas, who happen to have different toppings and different features than cheese pizzas, and have their own problems to face because, well, they're pizzas. This brings up the point of intersectionality, which is a form of feminism that is inclusive of various identities and advocates for the justice of all historically oppressed groups. This includes people of color, LGBTQ plus people, people with disabilities, and so forth. Intersectionality is key to feminism because discrimination is layered. For example, racism is often sexualized, and sexism is often racialized. Intersectionality is key to a frame that recognizes the multiple aspects of identity that enrich our lives and our experiences and make up different forms of oppression too. One of the most commonly discussed topics in feminism is patriarchy, which is a social standard that oppresses women while privileges men. However, feminism has moved on from being purely connected with male privilege. People face different levels of oppression in life. You can't be 100% oppressed or 100% privileged because identity is composed of tons of different factors. For example, someone can be privileged by the fact that they are straight and rich, while being oppressed by the fact that they are black and female. Let's zoom in a little and look at one of the most cited pieces of evidence for the oppression of women: violence targeting women and girls. CDC data shows that between 25% and 50% of women experience gender-based violence, like sexual violence, partner abuse, and harassment in their lifetime. Now let's get a bit closer and see how there's more to the data than there seems. For example, people of color, regardless of gender, are more likely to experience these forms of violence than white women and white men. Poverty also makes people more likely to experience violence. Bisexual women are more likely to be targets of sexual violence than any other women. GLAAD research shows that among people who have been targets of hate violence, 78% were people of color, and transgender people are 27% more likely to be the victim than cisgender people. Sure, women already are being at risk of violence in the US, but add the layer of race, add the layer of sexuality, and they become a lot more likely to become the victim. Another reason why we need intersectionality is to support the transgender community. Transgender adolescents are more likely to become targets of discrimination and violence than so many other groups. They face an overwhelming level of verbal harassment, physical harassment, and assault in school setting. Teachers and administrators frequently fail to protect trans youth and often contribute to their harassment. Even home does not always provide the safest place for trans adolescents to explore their identities. The system fails to meet the emotional and physical needs of trans youth, and they're forced to navigate a hostile world with little familiar or institutional support. Depression and suicidality is also, unfortunately, extremely common among the trans community. According to a GLAAD case study, more than half of all trans youth attempt suicide. The cis-heteronormative patriarchy fails to recognize the humanity of non-binary youth and deems them as social rejects. Trans youth are unfortunately shoved into the corners of society. They makes the static imposition of gender norms. You're either male or female, and you have to conform to the gender you were born with. This is another reason why feminism should be intersectional. We have to include trans people, because our struggle should not only focus on making feminism more inclusive. This is about making trans people and other marginalized members of the feminist movement a central part of feminism. We must realize that feminism is not equality for both genders, it's equality for all genders. Cis-sexism is a form of sexism that excludes trans people and assumes that everybody conforms to the gender they were born in. We've all grown up in a cis-sexist environment and have been exposed to it whether we realize it or not. So now, even when we see it happening at ED, it just flies past us because that's how we've been raised. Since we were children, our teachers and parents have taught us the fundamental assumption that everybody is either a boy or a girl. You have to conform what you were born with, and there's a set of stereotypes that you have to follow. This ends up excluding people who identify as another gender or none at all. Even well-meaning, positive, and empowering movements like pro-choice make the assumption that everybody who needs an abortion is a woman. It's great that we're advocating for female reproductive autonomy, but while doing so, we should not be ignoring everybody else. If we really want a proper pro-choice movement, we should extend our great intentions to the trans community as well. Being a person of color, on the other hand, is also ignored by many feminist movements. It is yet another topping that is referenced by Hughes. Racism and sexism, however, are more connected than you might think. Racialized sexism is what happens when women of color are targeted not for their gender, not for their race, but for both at the same time. For women of color to have their racial experiences denied because of the basis of their gender creates a really non-inclusive space that is really bad for the feminist movement. Racialized sexism has given birth to a range of stereotypes about women of color that leads to the fetishization and dehumanization. Racialized sexism treats women of color like they're token minorities in self-proclaimed feminist spaces that aren't actually completely safe. So this is what racialized sexism looks like, and you've probably seen a lot of it. Asian women are so exotic. Black women are so sassy. All of these stereotypes and insults that are specifically meant to mock and devalue women of color cannot be treated as racist or sexist alone, because they are both. We should humanize our path to equality and understand that without intersectionality, we erase people's identity and their experiences. One-size-fits-all movements are not inclusive. Yes, I know, it's really terrible that women have to deal with sexism, but not all women have to deal with racialized sexism and transphobia. Going back to the analogy of pizza and burgers, Hughes discusses why it's so important that feminism is intersectional. I think it's time we talk about feminism a little differently. While it's great and delightful to have such broad discussions about sexism and feminism on the internet, it's pretty clear that the majority of the issues discussed seem to only highlight the plight of white women. She illustrates the crux of intersectionality by saying, as great as it is to uplift cheese pizzas, the world could use a lot more flavor.